The eviction notice trembled in Sarah Chen's calloused hands like a yellow leaf about to fall. 28 days. That's all the time she had left before her children would have no roof over their heads, no place to call home in a world that had already stripped away so much. The paper crinkled as her grip tightened, the sound echoing through their cramped apartment where paint peeled from the walls like old scabs and the heater had been broken for 3 months running. "Mama? What's that paper say?" 8-year-old Emma's voice cut through the silence, her wide brown eyes reflecting the kind of worry that no child should have to carry. She sat cross-legged on the threadbare carpet, her school clothes patched and repatched, a testament to Sarah's determination to keep her children looking presentable even when everything else was falling apart. Sarah folded the notice carefully, tucking it into the pocket of her uniform from the diner where she worked double shifts just to scrape together enough for groceries. "Nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart. Just some paperwork." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but what else could she say? That they were about to lose everything? That despite working 70 hours a week, she still couldn't make ends meet? That her ex-husband's gambling debts had destroyed their credit so thoroughly that no landlord would give them a second chance? The phone rang again, and this time Sarah forced herself to answer. "Hello? Is this Sarah Chen, formerly Sarah Chen Martinez?" "Yes, this is Sarah." "Miss Chen, I'm calling from Robert Whitfield and calling from the law firm of Whitfield, Barnes & Associates. I'm handling the estate of Evelyn Chen, who I believe was your late husband's great aunt. I've been trying to reach you regarding an inheritance." Sarah sank into their second-hand chair, the one with the spring that poked through the cushion. An inheritance? From David's family? This had to be some kind of mistake. David's family had made it crystal clear what they thought of her after the divorce, the Asian wife who couldn't keep their golden boy in line, who somehow wasn't good enough to fix him or save him from himself. "I think there's been a mistake," Sarah said carefully. "David and I are divorced, and his family, well, we don't exactly stay in touch." "No mistake, Miss Chen. According to the will, Evelyn specifically left her property to you, not to David or any other family members. Quite unusual, actually. The will specifically states that the inheritance goes to Sarah Chen, who showed me kindness when others showed only obligation." Sarah's mind raced, trying to remember. David's great-aunt Evelyn. She'd only met her a handful of times. A stern woman who lived alone on some property out in the middle of nowhere. The kind of relative that families talked about in whispers. Sarah remembered visiting once, maybe twice, bringing homemade soup when Evelyn had been sick, actually listening when the old woman talked about her garden, her birds, her quiet life away from the city's noise and judgment. "What kind of property are we talking about?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 47 acres in rural Montana. The land includes a small house, some outbuildings, and apparently a few natural features, a small lake, some mineral rights, that sort of thing. To be perfectly honest with you, Ms. Chen, it's not particularly valuable. The house needs significant work, there's no cell service for miles, and the property taxes alone are quite substantial. Most people in your situation would probably be looking to sell immediately. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. 47 acres, a house, even if it needed work, space for her children to run and play without worrying about noise complaints from downstairs neighbors, a place where they could start over, where the ghosts of David's mistakes couldn't follow them. "I'd like to see it," she heard herself say. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Ms. Chen, I feel obligated to inform you that taking possession of this property would involve significant expenses. The property taxes are approximately $8,000 annually. The house hasn't been lived in for 6 months, and I'm told the roof needs substantial repairs. You might want to consider simply signing the deed over to a property company that specializes in these sorts of situations." They'd handle all the paperwork and give you a small sum for your trouble. $8,000 a year. Sarah did the math quickly in her head. That was more than she made in 3 months of the diner. But still, something in her chest refused to let go of this unexpected lifeline. How long do I have to decide? Legally, you can take as much time as you need. Practically, every month you wait is another month of property taxes and maintenance costs accumulating. The local property management company I mentioned has made a standing offer of $15,000 for a quick sale. It would solve all your immediate problems, Ms. Chen. $15,000. It would pay off their debts, cover the security deposit and first month's rent on a new apartment, maybe even leave enough for Emma to get those glasses she needed and for Marcus to have some new clothes that actually fit. It would be the smart thing to do, the practical thing. But as Sarah looked around their cramped apartment, at Emma's homework spread across a wobbly table, at Marcus's bedroom door closed against a world that seemed determined to disappoint him, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Dangerous, foolish, probably stupid hope. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, her voice growing stronger, "I'd like to see the property before I make any decisions. When would be the earliest I could arrange a visit?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Ms. Chen, are you quite certain? The property is extremely remote, and winter is coming. If you're thinking of actually living there with children, when can I see it?" A sigh traveled through the phone lines. "I could arrange for the keys to be available by this weekend. There's a small town called Millbrook, about 15 miles from the property. You could pick up the keys from the local bank. But, Ms. Chen, I really must advise you to think carefully about this. Rural Montana is not like city living. The nearest hospital is 40 miles away. The schools are quite basic, and the winters, well, they're not for the faint of heart." Sarah closed her eyes and saw Emma's face as she worried about that eviction notice, saw Marcus's carefully hidden hunger, and felt the weight of failure that had become her constant companion. Sometimes the only way forward was to leap into the unknown and hope that something would catch you before you hit the ground. "I'll be there this weekend," she said. After she hung up the phone, Sarah sat in the growing darkness of their apartment, listening to her children moving through their evening routines. Outside, the city hummed with its endless noise, sirens and car horns, and the distant rumble of trains carrying people to destinations unknown. But for the first time in months, Sarah wasn't listening to the sounds of the world she knew. Instead, she was imagining silence. Vast, clean silence, broken only by wind through trees and the laughter of her children as they discovered what it meant to have space to breathe. It was probably foolish. It was definitely impractical. It would require everything she had and more than she knew how to give. But sometimes, Sarah thought, as she finally rose to start dinner with whatever she could find in their nearly empty cupboards, foolish was just another word for brave, and brave, she was beginning to realize, might be the only thing she had left to be. If you're enjoying this story of courage against impossible odds, please take just 30 seconds to hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear about second chances. Your support helps us bring you more inspiring stories like Sarah's. The decision to drive to Montana felt like stepping off a cliff in slow motion. Sarah had exactly $347 in her checking account, money that should have gone to groceries, to the electric bill that was already 2 weeks overdue, to the small mountain of necessities that kept growing no matter how hard she tried to chip away at it. Instead, she found herself at a gas station at 5 in the morning, pumping fuel into their ancient Honda Civic while Emma and Marcus slept in the back seat, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The car wheezed and rattled like an old man climbing stairs, and Sarah whispered promises to it the way other people prayed. "Just get us there and back," she murmured, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. "Just this once. Don't let me down." She'd called in sick to the diner, the first time in 2 years, and the lie had burned in her throat like acid. Margie, the manager, had been understanding enough, but Sarah could hear the disappointment in her voice. Good employees didn't call in sick on Friday mornings during the breakfast rush. Good employees didn't abandon their post to chase pipe dreams across state lines. But then again, good employees also didn't face eviction notices while working 70 hours a week. The drive stretched ahead of them like a question mark. 8 hours to Millbrook, Montana, according to the GPS on her cracked phone screen. 8 hours of hoping the car wouldn't break down, that they wouldn't get pulled over, that this insane gamble might somehow pay off. Sarah had packed everything she could think of. Snacks bought with precious dollars, water bottles filled from the tap, a health kit she'd assembled from dollar store supplies, and a road atlas she'd found at a garage sale because her phone's battery wouldn't last the whole trip. "Where are we going again?" Emma's voice drifted from the back seat as they merged onto the interstate, sleep still thick in her words. "To see a house that might become our new home," Sarah said, the words feeling strange and impossible in her mouth. Marcus stirred, pushing himself up from where he'd been slumped against the window. At 12, he was old enough to understand that their lives had been a series of disappointments, old enough to be suspicious of anything that sounded too good to be true. "What's wrong with our apartment?" Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. How could she explain that their apartment was a trap, a place where dreams went to die slowly? How could she tell him about the eviction notice, about the way her manager at the diner looked at her like she was already replaceable, about the nights she lay awake calculating and recalculating expenses that never quite added up to solvency? "Sometimes," she said carefully, "life gives you opportunities to start fresh. This might be one of those times." "Dad used to say that too," Marcus replied, and the words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Sarah felt the familiar stab of guilt and anger that always accompanied any mention of David. He had said that over and over again. Every new job was going to be the one that turned everything around. Every gambling win was going to solve all their problems. Every promise was going to be the last one he'd ever have to make. Until the promises became lies, and the lies became the foundation of a life that crumbled under the weight of its own deception. "This is different," Sarah said, and she prayed with everything in her that it actually was. The miles rolled by in a rhythm of tire noise and wind, punctuated by the occasional rattle from somewhere in the car's aging engine. They played word games to pass the time, counted license plates from different states, and shared the sandwiches Sarah had made from the last of their bread and peanut butter. It felt almost like a vacation, if you could ignore the undercurrent of desperation that flavored everything like salt in a wound. As they crossed into Montana, the landscape began to change in ways that made Sarah's chest tighten with something that might have been hope or might have been terror. The cities gave way to towns, and the towns gave way to stretches of land so vast and empty that they seemed to swallow the horizon. Mountains rose in the distance like sleeping giants, their peaks touched with snow even though it was barely October. "It's so big," Emma whispered, her face pressed against the window. And it was. Big in a way that made Sarah feel simultaneously insignificant and infinite. In the city, she'd lived her life in small spaces, cramped apartments, narrow aisles at the diner, the front seat of this ancient car. Here, the world stretched in all directions, endless and clean and terrifying in its possibilities. They stopped for lunch at a truck stop that looked like it had been built in the 1970s and forgotten about ever since. The food was greasy and overpriced, but Emma and Marcus ate like they hadn't seen a hot meal in weeks, which Sarah realized with a pang of guilt wasn't far from the truth. She nursed a cup of coffee and watched other travelers come and go. Truckers with faces weathered by miles and loneliness, families on vacation with clean clothes and easy laughter, retired couples in RVs living the American dream 1 mile at a time. "Montana," Sarah said, looking at some property. Dolores nodded approvingly. "Beautiful country up that way. You planning to settle down?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Were they planning to settle down? Sarah had been living in survival mode for so long that planning felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But looking at her children, Emma with ketchup on her chin and excitement in her eyes. Marcus trying to hide his interest behind teenage indifference. She realized that maybe planning wasn't a luxury at all. Maybe it was a necessity. "Maybe," Sarah said. "We'll see what the property looks like." "Well, I hope it works out for you," Dolores said, refilling Sarah's coffee without being asked. "Sometimes the best decisions are the ones that scare you the most." Back on the road, the afternoon stretched long and golden, casting everything in the kind of light that made even the most ordinary things look magical. Emma had fallen back asleep, exhausted by the excitement and the miles, but Marcus stayed awake, staring out the window with the kind of intensity that reminded Sarah of herself at that age, always watching, always calculating, always trying to figure out what came next. "Mom," he said quietly, "what if this doesn't work out?" The question Sarah had been avoiding all day, the fear that had been riding shotgun since they'd left the city. What if the property was uninhabitable? What if the costs were more than they could handle? What if this was just another false hope in a life that had already served up too many disappointments? "Then we'll figure something else out. We always do." "But what if we can't? What if we end up with nothing?" Sarah pulled over at a rest stop, not because they needed gas or food, but because this conversation deserved more than divided attention on a busy highway. She turned to face her son, this boy who was growing up too fast, who carried worries that should have been hers alone. "Marcus," Sarah said, "you know what I was most afraid of when your father and I got divorced?" He shook his head. "I was afraid that I wouldn't be enough, that I wouldn't be strong enough or smart enough or good enough to take care of you and Emma by myself. And you know what? I was right. I'm not enough. I can't do everything, I can't fix everything, and I can't promise you that life is going to be easy or fair or even make sense most of the time." Marcus's face fell, and Sarah reached over to squeeze his hand. "But here's what I've learned. Being enough isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up every day and doing the best you can with what you have. It's about taking care of the people you love, even when you don't know how you're going to manage it. And sometimes it's about taking risks that scare the hell out of you because staying safe isn't actually safe at all." "Are you scared now?" "Terrified," Sarah admitted. "But I'm also hopeful, and I haven't felt that way in a long time. So maybe being scared isn't the worst thing in the world." They drove the final 2 hours in comfortable silence, the landscape growing wilder and more remote with each passing mile. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that no city dweller ever got to see, they reached Millbrook. The town was smaller than Sarah had expected, a main street with maybe a dozen businesses, most of them looking like they'd been there since Montana was still a territory. The bank was a solid brick building with a hand-painted sign and windows that actually opened. And when Sarah walked in to collect the keys to Evelyn's property, she felt like she'd stepped back in time. "You must be Sarah Chen," the bank manager said. He was a man in his 60s with white hair and the kind of handshake that spoke of honest work and straightforward dealing. "I knew Evelyn pretty well. She banked here for 30 years. "What was she like?" Sarah asked, suddenly curious about this woman who had remembered her kindness and turned it into an inheritance. "She was stubborn as hell, if you'll pardon the expression. Independent to a fault. She loved that land of hers more than most people love their own children. Spent every day of the last 15 years trying to turn it into something special." His expression grew more serious. "I have to tell you, though, that property's been empty for 6 months now. And Montana winters aren't kind to empty houses. You might want to prepare yourself for what you're going to find out there." As they drove the final 15 miles to the property, following a 2-lane road that seemed to lead into the middle of nowhere, Sarah felt the weight of all her choices pressing down on her like the vast Montana sky. The GPS on her phone had long since given up, and she was navigating by the handwritten directions Bill had given her, looking for landmarks that might or might not still exist. Turn left at the lightning-struck pine, continue for 2 miles until you see the stone gateposts. Then suddenly, there they were. 2 pillars of rough stone marking the entrance to a dirt road that disappeared into a stand of pine and aspen trees. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she turned onto the property, the car bumping and jolting over ruts and rocks, branches scraping against the windows like fingers trying to hold them back. The road curved through the trees for what felt like forever, and then opened into a clearing that took Sarah's breath away. A small lake stretched out before them, its surface reflecting the last light of day like polished silver. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks sharp against the darkening sky, and in the center of it all sat a house that looked like something from a fairy tale. It was smaller than Sarah had expected, built of logs that had weathered to a silvery gray, with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides and windows that caught the last rays of sunlight like jewels. Behind the house, she could see outbuildings, a barn, a small cabin, structures she couldn't identify in the gathering dusk. But it was the silence that struck her most powerfully. After a lifetime of city noise, sirens and traffic and the constant hum of humanity pressed too close together, this silence felt like a physical presence, deep and clean and absolute, broken only by the gentle lap of water against the shore and the whisper of wind through pine needles. "Whoa," Emma breathed, awake now and staring out the window with wide eyes. "It's like a movie." Marcus said nothing, but Sarah could see the wonder in his face, the careful mask of teenage indifference slipping just enough to reveal the boy underneath. Sarah parked the car and stepped out onto ground that felt different beneath her feet, solid and real in a way that city pavement never had. The air was thin and sharp, carrying scents of pine and water and something else she couldn't identify. Space, maybe. Freedom. The possibility of a life lived on their own terms. She walked to the edge of the lake, her children flanking her, and looked out over water so clear she could see the bottom 20 feet from shore. Fish moved in the depths like shadows, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called with a voice she'd never heard before. "Is this really ours?" Emma asked in a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell and send them tumbling back to their cramped apartment and eviction notices. Sarah fumbled with the keys Bill had given her, hands trembling not from cold, but from the magnitude of the moment. This place, this impossible, beautiful, terrifying place, could be their home, could be the foundation for a life she'd never dared to imagine. But first, they had to see if the house was even livable. First, they had to find out if fairy tales could survive the harsh reality of broken plumbing and winter heating bills, and all the 1,000 practical concerns that turn dreams into disasters. "Let's find out," Sarah said, and together they walked toward the house that might be their salvation or their ruin, carrying nothing but hope and each other under a sky full of more stars than any of them had ever seen. The key turned in the lock with a satisfying click that seemed to echo across the lake. Sarah pushed open the heavy wooden door, and the smell hit them immediately. Not the musty odor of abandonment she'd expected, but something else entirely. Pine, leather, and underneath it all, the faint scent of lavender, as if someone had been caring for this place right up until yesterday. Emma squeezed past her into the house, her footsteps echoing on wide plank floors that gleamed in the moonlight streaming through tall windows. "Mom, look at this place." Sarah fumbled along the wall until she found a light switch, half expecting nothing to happen. But when she flipped it, warm light flooded the room, revealing an interior that made her breath catch in her throat. The main room was huge, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and exposed beams overhead that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. The furniture was simple but well made. A leather sofa that looked like it had been loved for decades, bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with volumes that seemed to have been chosen by someone who actually read them. But it was the walls that made Sarah's heart skip. Every available surface was covered with photographs, maps, and what looked like scientific diagrams. Photos of the lake in different seasons, charts showing water levels and temperatures, geological surveys,
and botanical drawings of local flora. It was as if the house itself was a research station, a love letter to this piece of land written in meticulous detail. "Who was this woman?" Marcus asked, running his finger along a shelf lined with journals, each one labeled with dates going back 20 years. Sarah picked up one of the journals at random, opening it to a page covered with Evelyn's careful handwriting. The entry was dated just 6 months ago. Water temperature holding steady at 54 degrees despite unusual October warmth. The thermal dynamics here continue to fascinate me. I'm convinced there's something unique about this aquifer system, something that could change everything if the right person understood what they were looking at.
She was some kind of scientist, Sarah murmured, flipping through pages of observations, measurements, and theories about groundwater systems and mineral deposits. Look at all this work. Emma had discovered the kitchen, and her delighted gasp drew them deeper into the house. The kitchen was like something from a magazine spread about rustic elegance. Copper pots hanging from hooks, a farmhouse sink big enough to bathe a small child, and a wood-burning stove that radiated warmth even though no one had lived here for months. But it was Marcus who made the discovery that changed everything. He'd wandered into what looked like a study, drawn by a collection of old mining equipment displayed on the walls. "Mom," he called, his voice strange and tight, "you need to see this." Sarah found him standing in front of a desk covered with papers, his face pale in the lamplight. Spread across the surface were geological surveys, water rights documents, and what looked like correspondence with several mining companies. But it was the letter on top that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. It was addressed to Evelyn Chen, dated just 2 weeks before her death, from something called Rockwell Mining Consortium. The letterhead was expensive, the kind of heavy paper that spoke of serious money and serious intentions. "Dear Miss Chen," Sarah read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "As discussed in our previous correspondence, Rockwell Mining Consortium remains extremely interested in acquiring your property for our next phase of resource extraction. Our geological surveys indicate the presence of significant rare earth mineral deposits, as well as what our hydrologists believe may be one of the largest untapped freshwater aquifers in the northern Rocky Mountain region." Emma looked up from where she'd been exploring the kitchen cabinets. "What's an aquifer?" "Underground water," Marcus said absently, reading over Sarah's shoulder, "like a giant lake underground." Sarah continued reading, her heart hammering. "We are prepared to offer you $12 million for a complete transfer of all property rights, including mineral and water rights. This offer represents a significant increase from our previous proposals and reflects our urgent need to begin extraction operations before winter weather makes access impossible. Please respond at your earliest convenience." $12 million? The number seemed to float in the air above them like something from a dream. Sarah read the letter again, then a third time, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Evelyn had been sitting on a property worth $12 million and had chosen to live here alone, documenting water temperatures and photographing wildflowers. "There's more," Marcus said, shuffling through the papers. He handed her another letter, this one from something called Continental Resource Management. They offered $15 million. Sarah's hands shook as she read. $15 million for water rights and mineral extraction? She thought about the property management company that had offered her $15,000 for a quick sale and suddenly understood why they'd been so eager to handle all the paperwork for her. "Mom," Emma's voice was small and confused, "does this mean we're rich?" Before Sarah could answer, headlights swept across the windows, cutting through the darkness outside. A car was coming up their road, moving fast enough to kick up gravel that rattled against the house like hail. Sarah's protective instincts kicked in immediately. "Kids, get away from the windows." She moved to the front door, peering out through the small glass panes. A black SUV with tinted windows had pulled up beside their Honda, and 2 men in expensive suits were getting out. Even in the darkness, she could see they moved with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about being told no. The knock on the door was firm, authoritative, the kind of sound that demanded immediate response. Sarah took a deep breath and opened the door, but kept the chain lock engaged. "Miss Chen?" The man who spoke was in his 50s with silver hair and eyes like winter sky. "I'm James Rockwell from Rockwell Mining Consortium. I apologize for the late hour, but we saw your lights and realized you'd made it to the property. How did you know I'd be here?" Sarah asked, not moving to unlock the chain lock. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Small towns, small minds, big mouths. Bill Morrison at the bank mentioned you'd picked up the keys. We've been waiting for someone from the family to show up so we could discuss our proposal in person. I'm not interested in selling, Sarah said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. The second man stepped forward, younger than Rockwell but with the same aura of barely contained aggression. Miss Chen, I don't think you understand the situation here. This property sits on top of one of the most significant rare earth mineral deposits in North America. We're talking about resources that are essential for national security, materials needed for everything from cell phones to military applications. And the water rights, Rockwell added, represents a resource that's going to become increasingly valuable as climate change affects traditional water sources. We're offering you a chance to be part of something bigger than yourself. Sarah felt Emma and Marcus pressing close behind her, their fear palpable in the darkness. I said I'm not interested, it's late, and you're trespassing on private property. Rockwell's smile faded. Ms. Chen, you're a single mother with 2 children, working at a diner in the city. You have no experience managing a property this remote, no understanding of the complexities involved in water rights and mineral extraction. Winter's coming, and this place becomes completely inaccessible for months at a time. What exactly do you think you're going to do out here? The condescension in his voice lit a fire in Sarah's chest that had been building for years. Every time David's family had looked at her like she wasn't good enough, every time her manager at the diner had treated her like she was replaceable, every time someone had assumed that because she was struggling financially, she must also be stupid. I'm going to figure it out, she said, just like I've figured out everything else. 16 million, the younger man said suddenly. Final offer. Cash. Paid within 30 days. You can walk away from this place and never have to worry about money again. $16 million. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. 16 million would solve every problem she'd ever had. College for both kids, a house in a good neighborhood, security for the rest of their lives. She could quit the diner, never again have to smile while serving coffee to people who looked right through her like she was furniture. But something in Rockwell's desperation made her pause. If they were willing to go from 12 million to 16 million in the space of a single conversation, what was this property really worth? And why the urgency? Why show up at night, unannounced, pressure tactics disguised as generous offers? I need time to think, Sarah said. Time is exactly what you don't have, Rockwell replied, his pleasant facade cracking. There are environmental impact studies that need to be filed, permits that need to be obtained, equipment that needs to be moved into position before the first snow. Every day you delay costs us hundreds of thousands of dollars. That sounds like your problem, not mine. The 2 men exchanged glances, and something passed between them that made Sarah's skin crawl. Ms. Chen, I hope you'll reconsider. This is a complicated situation, and you're not equipped to handle the kinds of pressures that come with owning a property like this. There are regulatory issues, environmental concerns, legal complexities that could tie you up in court for years. Are you threatening me? I'm trying to protect you, but his voice had gone cold. This isn't the city, Miss Chen. Out here, people depend on each other for survival. It would be unfortunate if you found yourself on the wrong side of that equation. Sarah slammed the door and threw the deadbolt, her heart racing. Through the window, she watched the 2 men stand on her porch for a long moment, talking in voices too low to hear. Finally, they got back in their SUV and drove away, but not before sitting in the driveway for several minutes, as if making sure she understood they could come back any time they wanted. Mom, what's happening? Emma's voice was small and scared. Sarah gathered both children close, their warmth grounding her in the midst of her spinning thoughts. I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to figure it out. They spent the rest of the night huddled together on Evelyn's leather sofa, going through her papers and journals by lamplight.
What they discovered painted a picture of a woman who had been far more than an eccentric hermit. Evelyn Chen had been a hydrologist with a PhD from MIT, a woman who had worked for major consulting firms before retreating to this remote property to conduct her own research. And the mineral deposits weren't just valuable for mining companies. They included rare earth elements that were essential for renewable energy technology. She knew, Marcus said, looking up from a journal entry dated just a week before Evelyn's death. She knew what they were after, and she knew it was worth way more than they were offering. The entry he'd found was like a message from beyond the grave. They think I'm just a foolish old woman who doesn't understand the value of what she has. But I've done the calculations. Conservative estimates put the mineral rights alone at over $200 million. Add in the water rights, the geothermal potential, and the strategic location, and this property could be worth $500 million or more. But only if it's developed responsibly, sustainably, with respect for the ecosystem that took thousands of years to create.
Evelyn had been trying to find a way to unlock that potential without destroying the very thing that made it valuable. Her correspondence with universities, environmental groups, and sustainable energy companies painted a picture of someone trying to build a coalition of interests that could develop the property in a way that would benefit everyone, not just mining executives and shareholders. "There's something else," Emma said, holding up a hand-drawn map that had been tucked inside one of the journals. "Look at this." The map showed the lake and the surrounding area, but with details that weren't visible from the surface. Underground caverns, aquifer connections, and what looked like a massive geothermal system that extended far beyond the boundaries of Evelyn's property. But it was the notes in the margin that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Secondary access points compromised," Evelyn had written in red ink. "Evidence of unauthorized survey work. Suspect mineral rights theft through illegal drilling. Property adjacent to southern border shows signs of extraction activity not reported to county authorities." Sarah looked up at Marcus and Emma, seeing her own realization reflected in their faces. The mining companies weren't just trying to buy the property, they were already working on it, illegally, through adjacent land holdings. And if Evelyn had been documenting their illegal activities, if she'd been preparing to expose them. The sound of breaking glass from the kitchen made them all freeze. Sarah grabbed a poker from beside the fireplace and motioned for the children to stay behind her as she crept toward the sound. The kitchen window had been shattered, and sitting on the floor among the glass shards was a rock with a note wrapped around it. With trembling fingers, Sarah unwrapped the paper and read, "Stop digging or you'll find more than water underground." The next morning brought no relief. As Sarah stood on the porch with her first cup of coffee, made from beans Evelyn had left behind in an airtight container, she watched a helicopter circle overhead 3 times before flying away toward the mountains. An hour later, a truck with survey equipment drove slowly past the entrance to their road, the men inside making no attempt to hide their interest in the property. Her phone, which had barely had signal since they'd arrived, suddenly showed a full bars and a dozen missed calls, all from numbers she didn't recognize, all leaving voicemails with offers to purchase the property. Word was spreading fast, and Sarah began to understand that she and her children had walked into the middle of something much bigger and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. But it was the arrival of David's family that turned the situation from tense to explosive. Sarah was helping Emma collect kindling for the fireplace when the convoy of expensive cars came rolling up the dirt road like an invasion force. 3 vehicles, David's parents in their pristine Mercedes, his sister Catherine in her Lexus SUV, and his brother Robert in a Tesla that looked wildly out of place in the Montana wilderness. David's mother, Patricia Martinez, emerged from the lead car wearing designer hiking boots that had never seen actual hiking and an expression that could have cut glass. She'd never forgiven Sarah for divorcing her precious son, never acknowledged that David's gambling addiction and lies had destroyed their marriage. In Patricia's version of events, Sarah was the gold digger who had abandoned the family in their hour of need. Sarah,
Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Imagine our surprise when we learned that poor Aunt Evelyn had left her property to you instead of to her actual family. Robert, David's older brother and a lawyer who specialized in making problems disappear for wealthy clients, stepped forward with a briefcase and an expression of professional concern. "We're here to help, Sarah. This inheritance creates some complicated legal issues that we don't think you fully understand." Catherine, meanwhile, was already photographing the property with her phone, documenting everything like she was preparing for a real estate listing. "The house is in better shape than I expected. With some updating, this could be quite valuable." "It's not for sale," Sarah said firmly. Patricia laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "Oh, sweetheart, of course it is. You can't possibly think you're going to live out here with those children. No schools, no medical care, no civilization for miles. It's completely impractical." "More importantly," Robert added, opening his briefcase, "there are legal challenges to the inheritance that we need to discuss. Evelyn was quite elderly when she changed her will, and there are questions about her mental state at the time. We have medical records that suggest she was suffering from dementia." "That's not true. Her journals show she was completely coherent right up until she died." "Journals written by someone with a documented history of mental illness aren't exactly reliable evidence. We've already filed preliminary paperwork to contest the will. The property should rightfully go to David as the next male heir in the family line."
The casual sexism of it hit Sarah like a slap. Even in death, even divorced, she was still supposed to step aside for the men in David's family. Still supposed to accept that her needs, her children's needs, didn't matter as much as preserving the Martinez family wealth. "David is in rehab," Sarah pointed out, "again. And we're divorced. He has no legal claim to anything that was left to me." "That's where you're wrong," Catherine said, finally looking up from her phone. "We've been doing some research on Aunt Evelyn's will. The inheritance was left to Sarah Chen, but you legally changed your name back to your maiden name after the divorce. Technically, Sarah Chen no longer exists. You're Sarah Martinez now, at least according to some interpretations of the law." It was a technicality, the kind of legal loophole that expensive lawyers specialized in finding. Sarah had never legally changed her name back because the paperwork had been expensive and complicated, and she'd had bigger problems to deal with. She'd simply started using her maiden name again, and most people had been happy to accommodate her wishes. But apparently, that informal change could now be used against her. "You have 48 hours to vacate the property," Robert said, pulling official-looking documents from his briefcase. "After that, we'll be forced to have you removed for trespassing." Sarah looked at the papers he was handing her, the legal language swimming before her eyes like alphabet soup. But she understood enough to know that David's family had been planning this ambush for weeks, maybe months. They'd known about the property's value long before she did and had been preparing their legal challenge while she was still worried about making rent. "Get off my property," she said quietly. "Technically, it's not your property anymore. We have a court order giving us temporary custody pending resolution of the inheritance dispute." That's when Marcus stepped out of the house, carrying one of Evelyn's journals and wearing an expression of fury that reminded Sarah painfully of his father at his worst. "You want to know what your precious Aunt Evelyn really thought of your family?" he said, opening the journal to a page he'd clearly marked. "Listen to this." He began to read in a clear, carrying voice. "Patricia called again today, wanting to know when I'm going to stop this nonsense and move into a proper retirement community where the family can keep an eye on me. She doesn't understand that this land is my life's work, my legacy, my chance to prove that progress and preservation can coexist. She sees only dollar signs where I see decades of careful research. If something happens to me, I pray that the property goes to someone who will understand its true value, not its price tag, but its potential to change how we think about our relationship with the natural world. Patricia's face had gone white. "That's private property. You have no right to—" "There's more," Marcus continued, flipping pages. "Robert keeps sending me information about mining companies that want to buy the land. He doesn't seem to understand that selling to them would be like burning down a library to heat your house for one winter. The Rockwell people have been calling him directly, apparently offering him a finder's fee if he can convince me to sell. 20% of $12 million. Quite an incentive for family betrayal." The silence that followed was only broken by the sound of wind through pine trees and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Robert's face had gone red, and Catherine had stopped taking pictures. Even Patricia seemed to have run out of words. Finally, Robert found his voice. "This doesn't change anything. The legal challenges stand, and the property is still under dispute. You're still squatting on land that doesn't legally belong to you." "Actually, they're not," said a new voice. Everyone turned to see a woman in her 30s walking up the path from the lake, carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of confident expression that suggested she ate legal challenges for breakfast. She had dark hair pulled back in a professional bun, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and hiking boots that had actually been used for hiking. "Ms. Martinez family, I presume?" she said, extending her hand to Robert. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, environmental law specialist from the Natural Resources Defense Council. I've been working with Evelyn Chen for the past 2 years on a legal framework for sustainable development of this property." Robert reluctantly shook her hand. "I don't see how that's relevant to our inheritance dispute." Jennifer smiled, and it was sharp as a knife blade. "It's relevant because Evelyn anticipated exactly this scenario. She knew her family would challenge any inheritance that didn't go directly to them, so she took steps to protect her chosen heir." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick legal document. "This is a conservation easement that Evelyn filed with the state 6 months ago. It places permanent restrictions on how this property can be used, specifically prohibiting any form of industrial mining or large-scale resource extraction. The easement is legally binding regardless of who owns the property, and it comes with a substantial tax benefit that Evelyn structured specifically to offset the tax properties for a family in Sarah's income bracket." Sarah felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it nearly knocked her off her feet. Even in death, Evelyn had been protecting her, anticipating the greed and legal maneuvering that would follow her bequest. But Jennifer wasn't finished. More importantly, the conservation easement includes provisions for a resident caretaker who would be responsible for continuing Evelyn's research and maintaining the property according to strict environmental guidelines. That caretaker position comes with a salary of $60,000 a year, plus housing, plus educational funds for any dependent children. Patricia found her voice. "This is ridiculous. You can't just show up here with papers and expect us to believe, 'Oh, but I can,' because unlike your hastily filed inheritance challenge, this conservation easement was properly filed, notarized, and approved by both state and federal agencies. It's not a technicality or a loophole. It's a legal framework that Evelyn spent 2 years developing specifically to ensure this property would be protected from exactly the kind of exploitation your family and the Rockwell Consortium have in mind." She turned to Sarah with a genuine smile. Ms. Chen, and yes, the legal documents use your chosen name, properly filed and witnessed. You're not just inheriting a property. You're inheriting a job, a mission, and the legal backing to carry it out. Evelyn believed you were the right person to continue her work, and she made sure you'd have every tool you need to succeed. As David's family retreated to their expensive cars, making threats and promises to continue their legal challenge, Sarah stood on the porch of her new home and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the solid ground of security beneath her feet. Not the temporary safety of a steady paycheck or the false promises of get-rich-quick schemes, but the deep, foundational security of knowing she belonged somewhere, that she had work to do that mattered, and that someone had believed in her enough to trust her with something precious. The battle was far from over. Rockwell Mining would be back, and David's family wouldn't give up easily. But for the first time since she'd received that inheritance call, Sarah felt like she had a fighting chance. And more importantly, she felt like the fight might actually be worth it. The morning after David's family retreated, Sarah woke to find Jennifer Walsh sitting on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee and a laptop, working as if she'd been there for hours. The sun was just cresting the mountains, painting the lake in shades of gold and silver that made the whole world look newly created. "I hope you don't mind. I've been here since 5 a.m. There's something I need to show you, and it's better if we have some uninterrupted time before the vultures start circling again." Sarah poured herself coffee from the pot Jennifer had apparently made and settled into one of Evelyn's wooden chairs. After yesterday's revelations and confrontations, she felt like she was walking through someone else's life, playing a role in a story too big for her to fully comprehend. "How well did you know Evelyn?" Sarah asked. Jennifer's expression softened. Well enough to know that she didn't do anything by accident. Every decision was calculated, every choice was strategic. When she chose you as her heir, she'd been studying you for over a year. "Studying me?" Sarah nearly spilled her coffee. "What do you mean?" "She hired a private investigator, not to invade your privacy, but to understand who you really were, your work ethic at the diner, how you prioritized your children's needs over your own, the way you handled your divorce with David even when David's family tried to humiliate you. She read the court transcripts from your custody hearings, Sarah. She knew exactly how his family treated you." The idea that Evelyn had been watching her life from afar, documenting her struggles like one of her scientific experiments, should have felt invasive. Instead, she found it oddly comforting. Someone had been paying attention. Someone had seen her not as a victim or a failure, but as a person worthy of investment. She also knew about your engineering degree, the one you never got to use because you got pregnant with Marcus during your senior year. She knew you'd been 3 credits short of graduating when David convinced you to drop out and focus on being a wife and mother. Sarah's throat tightened. Those 3 credits had haunted her for 12 years, so close to a degree that could have changed everything, could have given her the financial independence to leave David years earlier. But every time she'd tried to go back and finish, life had intervened. First Marcus, then Emma, then David's addiction, and the bills, and the endless cycle of just trying to survive. Evelyn believed you could finish what she started here, not just as a caretaker, but as a partner, someone who could understand the engineering challenges of sustainable development, who could bridge the gap between environmental protection and practical solutions. "I'm not qualified for something like that. I'm a waitress who couldn't even finish college." Jennifer smiled. "That's exactly what Evelyn thought you'd say. She left instructions for that too." She pulled a sealed envelope from her briefcase, Sarah's name written across it in Evelyn's careful handwriting. She wanted you to have this after you'd seen the property, but before you made any decisions about your future. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written on the same paper Evelyn had used for her journals, and a smaller envelope marked, "For after you've read this." "My dear Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you've survived your first encounter with the forces that want to destroy this place. I hope you'll forgive an old woman's presumption in choosing your path without asking, but time was running short and the stakes were too high for delicate approaches." Sarah read on, her coffee growing cold as Evelyn's voice spoke to her from beyond the grave with the same clarity and purpose that filled her research journals. "You probably feel unqualified for what I'm asking of you. I felt the same way when I first came here 30 years ago, fresh out of graduate school with theories but no practical experience. This land was my teacher, Sarah. It showed me that true understanding comes not from textbooks, but from patient observation, careful listening, and the willingness to admit when you don't know something." The letter went on to describe Evelyn's vision for the property, not just as a conservation area, but as a working laboratory where sustainable technologies could be developed and tested. Solar and geothermal energy systems that could serve as models for remote communities worldwide. Water management techniques that could help drought-stricken regions. Agricultural methods that could increase food production while healing damaged soil. But the real treasure, Evelyn had written, isn't the minerals under the ground or the water in the aquifer. It's the knowledge waiting to be discovered, the solutions waiting to be invented, the proof that we can live in harmony with the natural world without sacrificing progress or prosperity. Sarah looked up to find Jennifer watching her intently. "She's asking me to become someone I've never been." "No," Jennifer said quietly. "She's asking you to become who you already are, but in a place where that person can flourish. The woman who worked 3 jobs to keep her children fed and housed, she'd thrive here. The mother who found creative solutions to impossible problems, she'd revolutionize sustainable living. The person who showed kindness to a lonely old woman when no one else bothered, she'd understand that this land needs an advocate, not an exploiter." Sarah opened the second envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000 and a note, "For finishing your degree. The University of Montana has an excellent environmental engineering program, and they offer distance learning for working parents. Your first semester is already paid for. The rest is up to you." $50,000. More money than Sarah had ever seen in one place, earmarked for a dream she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten it existed. She thought about all the times she'd looked at job postings that required engineering degrees, all the solutions she'd imagined for problems she encountered but couldn't implement without credentials, all the nights she'd fallen asleep wondering what her life might have been like if she'd been able to finish school. "There's more," Jennifer said gently, "but this next part requires a bit of a hike. Are you up for it?" An hour later, Sarah found herself following Jennifer along a trail that wound around the lake and up into the hills beyond. Emma and Marcus had wanted to come along, but Jennifer had suggested they spend the morning exploring the immediate area around the house, mapping out the buildings and getting familiar with their new surroundings. The trail was well maintained, despite Evelyn's absence, marked with small stone cairns and the occasional arrow carved into tree bark. As they climbed higher, Sarah began to notice things that didn't quite fit. Metal fixtures embedded in rocks, what looked like monitoring equipment disguised as natural features, and small structures that seemed to serve some scientific purpose. Evelyn spent 3 decades turning this entire property into an integrated research facility. What you see from the house is just the surface layer. The real work happens underground. They climbed for another 20 minutes before Jennifer stopped beside what looked like a natural rock formation, but when she pressed her hand against a specific spot, a hidden panel slid open to reveal a keypad and scanner. Evelyn updated her security systems every few years, Jennifer said, entering a code and placing her thumb on the scanner. She was paranoid about industrial espionage, and for good reason. What she discovered here could disrupt several billion-dollar industries. The rock face swung inward like a door, revealing a tunnel lit by LED strips that disappeared into darkness. Sarah felt a moment of claustrophobic panic. She'd never liked closed spaces, and the idea of going underground felt like being buried alive. But Jennifer was already walking into the tunnel with the confidence of someone who'd made this journey many times before. "The tunnel system is completely safe," she called back. "Evelyn had it engineered to withstand earthquakes, flooding, even explosions. She wasn't taking any chances." The tunnel sloped gently downward, lined with smooth concrete and ventilated by a system that kept the air fresh and breathable. Emergency lighting ran along both walls, and Sarah noticed alcoves every 100 feet or so that contained what looked like emergency supplies and communication equipment.
"How far does this go?" Sarah asked, her voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. "About half a mile," Jennifer replied. Evelyn spent 15 years having it excavated, bit by bit, using crews from different companies so no one would understand the full scope of what she was building. She told each team they were working on different projects: wine storage, root cellars, equipment sheds. By the time anyone realized what she'd actually created, it was too late to stop her. The tunnel ended at another hidden door, this one requiring both Jennifer's thumbprint and a retinal scan. When it opened, Sarah stepped into something that took her breath away. "The surface lake you can see from the house," Jennifer said, "is fed by this. But this underground lake is the real treasure. It holds approximately 95 million gallons of the purest fresh water on the North American continent." Sarah gripped the railing of the platform, trying to process what she was seeing. The underground lake was illuminated by a network of lights that revealed its true scope. It wasn't just a lake, it was an entire ecosystem. Fish swam in its depths, their movements creating ripples that caught the light like liquid silver. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, and along the shore she could see what looked like scientific equipment monitoring everything from water temperature to mineral content. Evelyn spent 20 years studying this ecosystem. What she discovered was that this isn't just a water source, it's a biological treasure trove. The mineral content creates conditions that support species that exist nowhere else on Earth. The thermal properties suggest geothermal activity that could power a small city. And the filtration system created by the limestone formations produces water so pure it barely registers on contamination tests. Sarah walked along the platform, marveling at the sight before her. This was what Rockwell Mining wanted to destroy. This was what David's family would sell to the highest bidder without a second thought. This cathedral of stone and water that had taken millennia to create would be gone in a matter of months if the wrong people gained control. "But here's the part that Evelyn was most excited about," Jennifer said, leading Sarah to a section of the platform equipped with computers and monitoring equipment. "The bacterial colonies living in this water appear to have unique properties for breaking down pollutants. She believed this ecosystem could be the key to developing biological water treatment systems that could clean up contaminated water supplies worldwide." She pulled up data on one of the computers, showing charts and graphs that meant little to Sarah, but clearly represented years of careful research. Preliminary tests suggest these bacterial colonies can neutralize heavy metals, break down petroleum products, and even process radioactive materials. If Evelyn was right, the biological processes happening in this lake could revolutionize environmental cleanup efforts. Sarah sank into one of the chairs positioned around the monitoring station, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd inherited. This wasn't just land or money or even a scientific discovery. This was hope for a planet struggling with pollution, climate change, and the aftermath of 100 years of industrial excess. She wanted to give it to the world, Sarah said, understanding finally dawning. She wanted to give it to someone who would give it to the world, Jennifer corrected. Evelyn knew that if she donated this property to a university or government agency, it would get buried in bureaucracy and politics. If she sold it to a corporation, even one with good intentions, profit motives would eventually corrupt the research.
She needed someone who would be motivated by the right reasons, someone who had skin in the game but wasn't corrupted by greed. Someone who had children who would inherit the consequences of our environmental choices, Sarah said softly. Jennifer nodded. She used to say that only a mother would fight hard enough to protect something this important. Only someone who had experienced real poverty would understand that true wealth isn't about money. It's about having enough clean water to drink, clean air to breathe, and a stable climate for future generations. They spent the next 2 hours exploring the underground facility. Evelyn had built more than just a research station. She had created an underground city capable of supporting a team of scientists and their families. Living quarters with their own water and power systems, laboratories equipped with state-of-the-art equipment, storage facilities filled with supplies that could last for months, even a small medical facility equipped for emergencies. She was preparing for a siege, Sarah realized, as they toured the living quarters. She knew the corporations would come eventually, and she wanted to be ready. She was also preparing for the climate crisis. Evelyn believed that within the next 20 years, conflicts over water rights would become as common as oil wars have been. She wanted this facility to serve as both a refuge and a research center where solutions could be developed even if the surface world was in chaos. But the final room on their tour brought Sarah to tears. It was clearly intended as a children's area, with bunk beds built into the rock walls, shelves lined with books and educational materials, and a small play area with toys that looked like they'd never been used. On one wall was a mural depicting the surface lake surrounded by wildlife, painted in the kind of loving detail that spoke of someone who had spent years observing and appreciating every aspect of the ecosystem above.
She never had children of her own, Jennifer said quietly, but she always hoped this place would someday ring with the laughter of kids who would grow up understanding that science and nature weren't separate things, but part of the same beautiful, complicated whole. Sarah touched one of the small beds, imagining Emma and Marcus sleeping underground, safe from corporate predators and family greed, while learning about hydrology and geology and environmental science from the best teacher of all, direct experience with the natural world. "What am I supposed to do with all this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the underground lake that reflected their lights like a mirror of stars. Evelyn left detailed plans for everything: funding streams from environmental foundations, partnerships with universities, even architectural drawings for expanding the surface facilities to accommodate visiting researchers. But she also left something else. She pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a video file. She recorded this 6 months before she died, when she knew her heart was failing, but before she'd finalized the inheritance. She wanted you to see it before you made your decision. Sarah's hands shook as she took the phone. On the screen, Evelyn Chen sat in the main room of the house above, looking directly into the camera with eyes that held fierce intelligence and deep compassion. "If you're watching this, Sarah," Evelyn's recorded voice said, "then you've seen what I've spent my life protecting and building. You're probably feeling overwhelmed, maybe even frightened by the responsibility I'm asking you to take on. That's good. Anyone who wasn't scared by this challenge wouldn't be the right person for it." Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her expression growing more intense. "I know about your struggles. I know about David's betrayal, his family's cruelty, the way poverty has forced you to make impossible choices between your children's needs and your own dreams. I know because I've been there. Not the same circumstances, but the same feeling of being trapped by other people's expectations and limitations." The old woman's voice grew warmer, more personal. "When I first met you at that family gathering, you were the only person who asked about my work. Not my health, not when I was going to move somewhere more convenient for everyone else, but my work.
You listened when I talked about water systems and ecological balance like they mattered to you. And when I was sick that winter, you brought soup and stayed to make sure I ate it. You saw me as a person, not an obligation." Sarah wiped away tears she didn't realize she'd been shedding. "That's why I chose you," Evelyn continued. "Not because you're perfect, but because you're real. Because you understand that every choice has consequences, that every decision affects the people you love most. Because you've had to be resourceful and creative and stubborn in the face of impossible odds. Those are exactly the qualities this place needs to survive and thrive." The video continued for another 10 minutes, with Evelyn outlining her vision for the property and her hopes for its future. But it was her final words that sealed Sarah's decision. "I'm not asking you to save the world, Sarah. I'm asking you to save this small piece of it, and to raise your children to understand that sometimes salvation starts with protecting what's right in front of you. The world will save itself if we give it enough examples of people who chose hope over fear, community over profit, and the long view over short-term gains." As the video ended, Sarah sat in the darkness of the underground cavern, surrounded by millions of gallons of pure water and the weight of responsibility that felt simultaneously crushing and liberating. Above them, her children were exploring their inheritance, mapping out a new life in a place where their mother would have meaningful work and they would have space to grow and learn and become whatever they chose to be. Jennifer waited patiently while Sarah processed everything she'd seen and heard. Finally, Sarah looked up and found her voice. "What do I need to do first?" Jennifer smiled, the expression transforming her professional demeanor into something warmer and more personal. "First, we make sure the legal challenges from David's family are definitively shut down. Then we start building the team of researchers and staff that Evelyn envisioned. And then we begin the work of proving that environmental protection and human prosperity aren't opposites, they're partners." As they made their way back through the tunnel toward the surface, Sarah felt something she'd almost forgotten how to experience: excitement about the future. For the first time in years, she was walking toward something instead of running away from the crisis. She had work to do that mattered, resources to do it with, and children who would grow up understanding their place in the larger story of human civilization's relationship with the natural world. The underground lake wasn't just 95 million gallons of water, it was 95 million gallons of possibility, flowing toward a future that Sarah was finally ready to help create. We're halfway through Sarah's incredible journey from eviction notice to environmental legacy. If this story resonates with you, please take a moment to subscribe and ring that notification bell. It takes less time than brewing a cup of coffee and helps us share more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. 6 months after that first night in Evelyn's house, Sarah stood in the main laboratory of the underground facility, watching data stream across multiple monitors while her morning coffee grew cold beside a stack of research papers she'd co-authored with scientists from 3 different universities. The transformation had been so gradual she hardly noticed it happening. One day, she was a struggling waitress facing eviction. The next, she was Dr. Sarah Chen, environmental engineer and director of the Evelyn Chen Research Institute. The doctor part was still new enough to make her smile. She'd finished her undergraduate degree through the University of Montana's distance learning program in record time, cramming 4 years of missed education in the 8 months of intensive study. Her professors had been amazed by her practical understanding of water systems and ecological balance, knowledge gained not from textbooks but from living and working alongside Evelyn's research for months on end. The graduate program had followed naturally. Her thesis on biological water treatment systems in natural aquifer environments had attracted attention from environmental scientists worldwide, leading to her first published paper and an invitation to speak at the International Conference on Sustainable Water Management. The shy waitress who used to avoid eye contact with difficult customers was now presenting research findings to audiences of hundreds. But it was the sound of children's laughter echoing through the underground tunnels that reminded her what all this work was really about. Emma and Marcus had adapted to their new life with the resilience that children possess when they finally feel secure. Emma, now 9, had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of local flora and fauna that impressed visiting botanists. She could identify bird species by their calls, knew which plants were edible and which were poisonous, and had started her own research project documenting the seasonal changes in the lake's ecosystem. Marcus, at 13, had discovered a talent for engineering that made Sarah's heart swell with pride. He designed and built an improved water monitoring system that was now being tested by researchers at Stanford. His bedroom walls were covered with schematics for renewable energy systems, and he spent his free time working with the facility's maintenance staff to understand how every system functioned. Most importantly, neither child had that look of constant worry that had marked their city life. They slept soundly, laughed easily, and talked about their futures with the confidence that came from understanding their place in the world. The legal battles had ended 3 months ago with a decisive victory that left David's family stunned and Rockwell Mining scrambling to find new targets. Robert's inheritance challenge had crumbled when confronted with the ironclad documentation Jennifer had prepared. The conservation easement stood firm, the Research Institute's legal status was unassailable, and Sarah's position as both heir and director was legally bulletproof. David himself had shown up once, fresh out of his latest rehab stint and full of apologies and promises. Sarah had met him at the gate to the property, flanked by Jennifer and 2 security guards they'd hired after Rockwell's increasingly aggressive tactics. The conversation had been brief and final. "I'm clean, Sarah," he'd said, the same words he'd spoken dozens of times before. "I want to be part of the kids' lives again. I want to help you with all this." "You can be part of their lives," Sarah had replied, her voice steady and calm. "You can call them, visit them, take them for weekends when you've proven you can stay sober for more than 6 months at a time. But this," she gestured toward the property behind her, "this is not about you anymore. This is about something bigger than our marriage, bigger than your addiction, bigger than any of our personal problems." David had left that day looking smaller somehow, diminished by his realization that the world had moved on without him. Sarah felt pity for him, but no longer the crushing responsibility to fix him that defined their marriage. She'd learned the difference between compassion and enablement, between loving someone and letting them destroy your life. Rockwell Mining's defeat had been more spectacular in public. Jennifer's investigation into their illegal drilling activities had uncovered a network of illegal crimes spanning 3 states. The FBI raid on their corporate headquarters had made national news, and the subsequent trials had sent 2 executives to prison while bankrupting the company with fines and cleanup costs. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her small act of resistance, refusing to sell the property, had exposed corruption that affected thousands of people and millions of acres of public land. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not by those seeking glory, but by those simply trying to protect what they loved. But Sarah's proudest achievement was the education program that had emerged organically from the Institute's work. Children from the local school district visited regularly, participating in hands-on science education that connected classroom theory to real-world environmental challenges. High school students competed for summer internships that provided them with research experience usually reserved for graduate students. And colleges across the country were sending their most promising environmental science majors to spend semesters learning at the Institute.
Emma and Marcus weren't just benefiting from this educational environment. They were helping to shape it. Emma's natural history observations had become part of the Institute's official ecological monitoring program. Marcus's engineering innovations were being incorporated into the facility's infrastructure improvements. Other children were learning not just from adult experts, but from peers who had grown up seeing environmental stewardship as a natural and exciting part of life. The funding for all this work had materialized exactly as Evelyn had predicted. Environmental foundations competed to support research at the Institute. Government agencies provided grants for studies that could inform policy decisions. Private donors contributed to educational programs that were producing the next generation of environmental leaders. And the patents on several water treatment innovations developed at the Institute were generating revenue that ensured its long-term financial stability.
Sarah often wondered what her life might have been like if she'd never answered that phone call from Robert Whitfield. She'd still be working at the diner, still struggling to make ends meet, still wondering if her children would have opportunities for college or careers that mattered to them. The eviction notice would have become reality, and they'd be living in whatever cramped apartment they could afford, always one crisis away from disaster. Instead, she woke each morning in a house filled with light and purpose, surrounded by work that could help heal a damaged world, and children who understood their potential to be part of that healing. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Learning to be a public figure had been terrifying for someone who'd spent years trying to be invisible. Speaking at conferences, managing staff, making decisions that affected dozens of lives, these responsibilities had pushed Sarah far beyond her comfort zone. There were days when imposter syndrome hit her so hard she could barely function, moments when she was convinced everyone would realize she was just a former waitress pretending to be qualified for work that mattered. But Jennifer had been there through all of it, serving not just as legal counsel, but as mentor and friend. Evelyn didn't choose you because you were already perfect, she'd reminded Sarah during one particularly difficult period when a visiting researcher had questioned Sarah's qualifications. She chose you because you had the capacity to grow into what this place needed. That growth process isn't always comfortable, but it's always worth it. The research itself had provided its own validation. Sarah's intimate knowledge of the property, combined with her fresh perspective on environmental challenges, had led to insights that purely academic researchers had missed. Her first major discovery, a network of underground springs that connected the property's aquifer system to water sources hundreds of miles away, had rewritten understanding of regional hydrology and informed water management policies across 3 states. The media attention that followed had been overwhelming at first. Reporters wanted to tell the story of the waitress who became a scientist, framing her journey as an inspirational human interest piece. But Sarah had learned to redirect those conversations toward the work itself, toward the urgent need for environmental protection, and the potential for scientific innovation to address climate challenges. "I'm not the story," she'd learned to say in interviews. "The story is what happens when we decide that short-term profits matter less than long-term survival. The story is what's possible when we choose to invest in solutions instead of just complaining about problems." That message had resonated beyond the scientific community. The Institute had become a pilgrimage site for environmental activists, policymakers, and educators who wanted to see proof that another way was possible. They came expecting to see cutting-edge technology, and left talking about the integration of science and community, the way the work at the Institute connected global challenges to local solutions. The local community had embraced the Institute with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone. Millbrook, the small town where Sarah had picked up the keys to the property, had transformed from a struggling rural community to a destination for ecotourism and scientific collaboration. The local school district had partnered with the Institute to develop environmental science curricula that were being adopted by schools nationwide. Young people who might have left for opportunities in big cities were now staying to build careers in emerging green technologies. Bill Morrison, the bank manager who'd warned Sarah about Montana winters, had become one of the Institute's strongest supporters. "Evelyn always said this land would change the world," he'd told a visiting journalist. "I thought she was just a stubborn old woman with big dreams. Turns out she was a visionary who found the right person to make those dreams come true."
Patricia had left early, apparently uncomfortable in an environment where accomplishment mattered more than social status or family connections. Sarah felt no satisfaction in her discomfort, only relief that the toxic dynamics of David's family no longer had any power over her children's futures. As winter approached, Sarah's second winter at the Institute, she found herself marveling at how different her relationship with the seasons had become. In the city, winter had been an enemy that increased heating bills and made everything more difficult. Here, winter was part of the natural rhythm that governed the research, a time for analyzing data collected during the active months and planning for the next year's projects. The underground facility made winter isolation not just bearable, but productive. The living spaces were comfortable and well-designed. The laboratories continued their work regardless of surface weather, and the constant temperature of the underground lake provided both research opportunities and a reminder that life continued even in the harshest conditions. Emma and Marcus had adapted to the seasonal rhythms with the flexibility of childhood. They helped with data analysis during the long winter evenings, participated in online classes that connected them with other children whose parents worked in remote research facilities, and developed hobbies that took advantage of their unique environment. Emma was learning to identify mineral samples and had started a collection that impressed visiting geologists. Marcus was designing heating and cooling systems that could be powered entirely by geothermal energy. But perhaps the most important change was in Sarah herself. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space now spoke with authority about policy changes needed to protect water resources. The mother who had worried about being enough for her children now served as a role model for parents trying to balance career and family responsibilities. The former waitress who had been invisible to most of the people she served now commanded respect from some of the world's leading environmental scientists. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal and spiritual as well. Living in daily contact with the natural world had changed how Sarah understood her place in the larger web of life. The underground lake wasn't just a research subject, it was a teacher that had shown her the patience of geological time, the persistence of life in challenging conditions, and the interconnectedness of all natural systems. She'd started keeping a journal, following Evelyn's example but with her own focus on the intersection of science and daily life. Her entries recorded not just scientific observations, but personal reflections on motherhood, work, and the responsibility that came with stewarding something larger than herself. "Today, Emma asked me if we'll live here forever," she'd written recently. "I told her that forever is a long time, but that this place will always be part of who we are no matter where life takes us. Then I realized that's what legacy really means. Not the things you pass down, but the ways you change the people you touch so they carry the best parts of what you've built into whatever they build next." That understanding had informed the Institute's newest initiative, a program to help other struggling families transition to careers in environmental science and sustainable technology. Sarah knew there were countless other single mothers, displaced workers, and young people whose potential was being wasted because they lacked opportunities or support systems. The Institute was beginning to offer scholarships, mentorship programs, and career training that could help them discover their own capacity for meaningful work. The program was still small, but its first participants were already showing remarkable results. A former coal miner was completing his degree in renewable energy systems. A single mother from Detroit was studying hydroponic agriculture that could bring fresh food to urban food deserts. A teenager from a reservation was developing water treatment systems specifically designed for rural communities with limited resources. These were Evelyn's true heirs, not people connected by blood or marriage, but people connected by shared commitment to solving problems and building a better future. Each success story validated Sarah's growing belief that environmental challenges weren't just technical problems requiring technical solutions, but human problems requiring human creativity, compassion, and determination. As Sarah finished her morning review of research data and prepared to join her children for breakfast, she reflected on how completely her definition of wealth had changed. 6 months ago, she thought wealth meant having enough money to pay the bills without constant anxiety. Now she understood that true wealth was having work that mattered, children who felt secure and valued, and the knowledge that her daily efforts contributed to solutions that could benefit people she'd never meet. The underground lake still held its 95 million gallons of pristine water. But Sarah now knew that wasn't the real treasure Evelyn had left her. The real treasure was the understanding that everyone has the capacity to be part of something larger than themselves, that environmental stewardship isn't a burden, but a privilege, and that the future belongs to those brave enough to believe it can be better than the present. Emma and Marcus were waiting for her in the kitchen, already dressed and eager to start another day of learning and exploration. Looking at them, Sarah could see the confidence that came from growing up in an environment where their curiosity was valued, their questions were taken seriously, and their potential was unlimited.
They would grow up to be part of the generation that inherited the consequences of humanity's environmental choices. But unlike so many children their age, they would inherit not just problems, but also the tools, knowledge, and confidence needed to solve those problems. They would understand that every challenge was an opportunity for innovation, that every crisis contained the seeds of transformation, and that the future was something they could actively create rather than passively endure.
That, Sarah realized, was the true meaning of Evelyn's inheritance. Not the transfer of property from one person to another, but the transfer of possibility from one generation to the next. The underground lake would eventually be passed to new stewards. The research institute would evolve and grow beyond anything its founders could imagine. And the children who learned there would carry its lessons to challenges not yet imagined. 25 years later, Dr. Evelyn Chen Rodriguez stood at the podium of the United Nations Climate Solutions Summit, looking out at an audience of world leaders, scientists, and environmental advocates from every corner of the globe. At 34, she commanded the same quiet authority that her mother had developed during her years at the Evelyn Chen Research Institute, but with an added confidence that came from growing up knowing exactly who she was and what she was meant to do. 25 years ago, Emma began, her voice carrying clearly through the massive assembly hall. My mother was a single parent facing eviction, working multiple jobs just to keep food on our table and a roof over our heads. Today, the water treatment systems developed at the institute she helped build provide clean drinking water to over 50 million people worldwide. In the audience, Sarah Chen felt the familiar surge of pride mixed with amazement that never quite faded when she watched her daughters speak to global audiences. At 57, Sarah's hair had gone silver, and laugh lines mapped the geography of years spent outdoors. But her eyes still held the fierce intelligence that had attracted Evelyn's attention all those years ago. Beside her sat Marcus Chen Park, now 38 and the lead engineer for the Global Geothermal Initiative, his own family arranged around him like a constellation of focused attention. His teenage son, Alex, was furiously taking notes on everything his aunt said, already planning his own presentation for the Youth Climate Leadership Conference next month. His daughter, Maya, only 10 but already showing signs of her grandmother's gift for seeing connections others missed, was sketching the assembly hall with the kind of precise attention to detail that suggested she might become the artist-scientist the world desperately needed. The transformation didn't happen overnight, Emma continued, clicking to a slide that showed the original Evelyn Chen Research Institute as it had looked 25 years ago. It happened because one woman, my great-aunt Evelyn, understood that real change requires patience, persistence, and the willingness to invest in solutions that might not pay off for generations. The next slide showed the institute as it existed today, a sprawling campus of sustainable buildings that housed research facilities, educational programs, and living spaces for the international community of scientists and students who came there to study and work. The original underground lake remained at the heart of it all, its biological treasures having revolutionized environmental cleanup efforts around the world. But it was the network of similar institutes that had grown from Evelyn's original vision that demonstrated the power of her legacy. From the Australian outback to the Canadian Arctic, from urban centers in Bangladesh to indigenous communities in the Amazon, research stations modeled on the Montana Institute were developing locally appropriate solutions to global environmental challenges. The work that began in a small lakeside laboratory in Montana now spans 6 continents and involves thousands of researchers, educators, and community leaders, Emma said, advancing to a world map dotted with lights representing each affiliated institute. But more importantly, it involves millions of young people who have grown up understanding that environmental stewardship isn't just possible, it's the most exciting career path of their generation. Sarah smiled, remembering Emma as a 9-year-old cataloging wildflowers and documenting bird migration patterns with the seriousness of a professional researcher.
The girl who had once worried about her mother's ability to pay rent had grown into a woman whose work influenced international environmental policy and inspired a generation of young scientists. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Emma's teenage years had been complicated by her growing awareness of the magnitude of environmental problems and her frustration with the slow pace of political change. There had been a period when she had wanted to abandon science for activism, convinced that research was too slow and too removed from the urgent needs of communities already suffering from climate change. It was Marcus who had helped her find the balance, showing her how engineering and activism could work together, how the most effective advocacy was backed by solid science and practical solutions. His own career had followed that principle, developing technologies that made renewable energy accessible to rural communities, while also working with policymakers to remove barriers to implementation.
My brother Marcus always says that the best science is invisible, Emma said, as if reading Sarah's thoughts, not because it's secret, but because it works so well that people forget it was ever a problem. 25 years ago, providing clean water to remote communities required massive infrastructure investments and ongoing maintenance that most governments couldn't afford. Today, biological water treatment systems based on research from the underground lake can be installed and maintained by local communities using materials and expertise available locally. The slide changed again, showing before and after photos of communities around the world that had implemented these systems. Villages in Kenya, where children no longer died from waterborne diseases. Indigenous communities in Alaska, where traditional ways of life could continue because clean water sources had been restored. Urban neighborhoods in Flint, Michigan, where residents could finally trust their tap water again. Each success story represented years of patient work, collaboration between scientists and communities, and the kind of long-term thinking that Evelyn had embodied. But more than that, each success story represented lives saved, potential unleashed, and hope restored to places where it had been absent for generations. The ripple effects go far beyond environmental restoration, Emma continued. When communities gain access to clean water, children, especially girls, can attend school instead of spending hours each day collecting water. When local people learn to install and maintain water treatment systems, they develop technical skills that lead to other opportunities. When communities take control of their own environmental challenges, they build the confidence and capacity to address other problems as well. Sarah thought about the letters she received regularly from former participants in the Institute's education and training programs. A young woman from Bangladesh who had used her water treatment expertise to start a social enterprise that employed dozens of women in her village. A former coal miner from West Virginia who had become a leader in his community's transition to renewable energy. A teenager from a Navajo reservation who had developed solar-powered water purification systems specifically designed for desert communities. Each letter was a reminder that Evelyn's vision had been right, that environmental solutions needed to be rooted in community needs and developed by people who understood local conditions. The Institute had never tried to impose one-size-fits-all solutions, but instead had focused on building capacity, sharing knowledge, and supporting local innovation. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Institute, Emma said, her voice growing warmer, is what it taught us about the relationship between environmental health and human potential. My mother used to say that you can't separate social justice from environmental protection because the same systems that degrade the environment also limit human opportunity. The next slide showed a photo of Sarah from 15 years earlier, standing with a group of single mothers who had completed the Institute's environmental technology training program. Several of the women in the photo were now running their own companies, developing green technologies, or leading environmental programs in their communities. The children in the background of the photo, including some who had been babies then, were now young adults working in environmental fields, carrying forward the understanding that economic security and environmental health were connected challenges requiring integrated solutions. The Institute didn't just produce scientific breakthroughs, it demonstrated that environmental careers could provide stable, meaningful work for people from all backgrounds.
It showed that you don't need advanced degrees or family connections to contribute to solving global challenges. You need curiosity, persistence, and the support of a community that believes in your potential. Sarah wiped away tears she didn't realize she'd been shedding. The scared single mother who had driven to Montana with her life savings in her pocket could never have imagined sitting in the United Nations listening to her daughter address world leaders about solutions that had grown from seeds planted in Evelyn's journals and laboratory notes. But the real measure of success wasn't in the global recognition or the scientific awards that filled display cases at the Institute. It was in the faces of the young people who approached Sarah after every conference, every public appearance, every community meeting where she spoke about the work. Young people who had grown up with climate anxiety and environmental despair, but who found hope in the proof that individuals could make a difference, that science could solve problems, and that their own potential was unlimited. The next generation of environmental leaders is already emerging, Emma said, advancing to a slide that showed young researchers at work in laboratories around the world. They're not waiting for permission to start solving problems. They're not intimidated by the scale of the challenges we face. They've grown up seeing environmental protection as an opportunity, not a burden, and they're developing solutions we couldn't have imagined 25 years ago. Alex Chen Park, Marcus's 16-year-old son, was prominent in several of the photos. He'd spent the previous summer working with marine biologists to develop coral reef restoration techniques using principles learned from the underground lake ecosystem. His research had already been published in peer-reviewed journals, and he'd been invited to speak at conferences across the country about the role of young people in environmental restoration.
But he wasn't unique among his generation. The global network of institutes had produced thousands of young people who saw environmental challenges as puzzles to be solved rather than disasters to be endured. They were developing artificial intelligence systems to monitor deforestation, designing biodegradable materials to replace plastics, and creating urban farming systems that could feed millions while reducing agriculture's environmental impact. What we've learned over the past 25 years, Emma said, approaching the conclusion of her presentation, is that environmental protection isn't just about preserving the past, it's about creating the future. Every restored watershed, every community that gains energy independence, every young person who chooses an environmental career is an investment in possibilities we can't yet fully imagine. The final slide showed a photo of the original underground lake, still pristine after decades of research and countless visitors. But superimposed over the image were photos of similar lakes, rivers, and ecosystems around the world that had been restored using techniques developed at the Institute. The underground lake had become a symbol not just of what needed to be protected, but of what could be achieved when protection and progress worked together. My great-aunt Evelyn once wrote that the future belongs to those brave enough to believe it can be better than the present. Today, millions of people around the world are proving her right. They're not waiting for someone else to solve environmental problems. They're rolling up their sleeves and getting to work. And they're discovering that the work of healing the world is also the work of healing our communities, our economies, and ourselves. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but Sarah barely heard it. She was thinking about Evelyn, wondering what the stubborn, visionary old woman would think of what her small lakeside laboratory had become. She would probably be amazed by the global reach of the work, but Sarah suspected she'd be most proud of the young people, the thousands of Emma and Marcus equivalents who had grown up understanding that their generation could be the one to finally get the relationship between humanity and nature right. After the formal presentations ended, Sarah found herself surrounded by the usual crowd of policymakers, reporters, and fellow scientists who wanted to discuss funding opportunities, research collaborations, and policy implications. But it was the smaller conversations that mattered most to her. The graduate student who wanted advice on community engagement strategies, the high school teacher looking for curriculum resources, a parent wondering how to inspire their children to care about environmental issues. Mrs. Chen, a young woman, approached as the crowds began to thin.
She looked to be in her early 20s, with the earnest expression of someone carrying important news. "I'm Dr. Priya Sharma from the New Delhi Water Institute. I wanted to thank you for the scholarship program that allowed me to study at the Montana Institute 5 years ago." "Of course. How have your work been going?" "I've been leading a project to implement biological water treatment systems in urban slums across India. We've provided clean water access to over 2 million people in the past 3 years, and we're training local technicians to maintain and expand the systems. But more importantly, we're documenting everything so that other communities can replicate our successes." These were the conversations that reminded Sarah why all the work had been worthwhile. Not the international recognition or the scientific awards, but the simple fact that somewhere in India, children were drinking clean water because a young woman had been inspired by a Montana lake to dedicate her career to solving water access problems. "There's something else," Priya continued. "I've been documenting our work with communities, and I keep finding the same pattern. Once people gain control over their water supply, they start tackling other challenges: better sanitation, renewable energy, education programs, small business development. It's like solving one environmental problem gives them confidence to solve others." That's exactly what Evelyn hoped would happen. She used to say that environmental work was really about helping communities remember their own power. As the evening wound down and the official receptions gave way to informal gatherings in hotel lobbies and coffee shops, Sarah found herself in a quiet corner with Emma and Marcus, their own families creating a small island of familiarity in the sea of international delegates. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd sold the property that first night?" Emma asked, settling her youngest daughter on her lap while her son continued to pepper his uncle with questions about geothermal engineering. Sarah considered the question seriously. The woman who had driven to Montana with her life savings and her desperate hopes felt like a different person now, someone she remembered fondly but could barely relate to. That woman had been running from crisis, making decisions based on fear and necessity. This woman was part of a global community working toward solutions, making choices based on possibility and hope.
But I don't think it would have solved our real problems: the poverty, the sense of powerlessness, the feeling that we were always at the mercy of other people's decisions. Taking Evelyn's money and selling the property would have been another temporary fix in a life full of temporary fixes. She paused, watching Alex explain something enthusiastically to his younger cousin, their heads bent over a tablet displaying what looked like architectural drawings for some kind of renewable energy system. "What everyone had really left us wasn't property or money," Sarah continued. "It was the understanding that we could be part of something bigger than our own problems, that we could contribute to solutions instead of just surviving crises, that our lives could have meaning beyond just getting by." Emma smiled, the expression so reminiscent of her childhood self that Sarah's heart squeezed with remembered love and pride. "She gave us permission to think long-term." Exactly. And once you start thinking in terms of decades instead of months, once you start seeing your work as part of something that will continue long after you're gone, everything changes. Your problems become smaller, and your possibilities become infinite. It was past midnight when they finally made their way back to their respective hotel rooms, but Sarah found herself too energized to sleep. Instead, she sat by her window overlooking the Hudson River, writing in the journal she'd kept faithfully for 25 years. The practice had started as a way to document the scientific and personal discoveries of her early years at the Institute, but had evolved into a meditation on the relationship between individual choices and collective transformation. Today, Emma spoke to world leaders about work that began with a scared single mother trying to find a safe place for her children, she wrote. The ripple effects of that one decision to drive to Montana instead of signing the eviction papers continue to spread in ways I could never have predicted. Children in Kenya drink clean water because of research that began in our underground lake. Young people around the world choose environmental careers because they've seen proof that such careers can provide meaningful, stable work. Communities that had given up hope are discovering their own power to solve problems. She paused, looking out at the river where lights from the city reflected like stars on the water's surface. But perhaps the most important ripple effect is the simplest one. Emma and Marcus grew up believing that their potential was unlimited, that their work could matter, that they could be part of healing the world instead of just surviving in it. They're raising their own children with that same confidence, that same sense of possibility. And those children will grow up to face challenges we can't yet imagine, but with tools and knowledge and hope that previous generations never had. Sarah closed the journal and prepared for bed, but first she allowed herself a few minutes to think about Evelyn, the stubborn, visionary old woman who had seen potential in a struggling waitress and invested everything in that potential, who understood that the most important inheritance wasn't money or property, but knowledge, values, and hope passed from one generation to the next. Evelyn had been gone for 26 years now, but her influence continued to ripple outward through the work of the institutes, the lives of the people they'd trained, and the children who grew up understanding that environmental stewardship wasn't a burden but an adventure. The underground lake still held its 95 million gallons of pristine water, still supported the unique ecosystem that had revolutionized understanding of biological water treatment. But its real treasure had always been its potential to inspire, to demonstrate that healing was possible, to prove that small actions could have enormous consequences when they were guided by love, sustained by persistence, and multiplied by community. As Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new young people eager to prove that their generation could be the one to finally get things right. The work would continue. The ripples would spread. And somewhere in the world, another scared parent facing impossible choices would discover that they had more power than they ever imagined. The future belonged to those brave enough to believe it could be better than the present. And thanks to one woman's vision and another woman's courage to embrace it, millions of people around the world were proving that belief right, one restored ecosystem at a time, one educated child at a time, one hope-filled decision at a time. Sarah's story proves that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage. If her journey inspired you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe for more stories about people who chose possibility over fear. What brave choice will you make today? The inheritance would continue, passing from generation to generation, growing stronger and more beautiful with each transfer until the day when clean water and clean air and a stable climate were not gifts to be preserved, but simply the foundation upon which humanity built its next chapter of growth and discovery.
3 days later, back in Montana, Sarah stood at the edge of the original underground lake, now accessible through an elegant glass elevator that had been installed 5 years earlier to accommodate the increasing number of visitors and researchers. The elevator was Marcus's design, a feat of engineering that allowed access without disturbing the delicate ecosystem below, its transparent walls providing breathtaking views of the cavern's natural architecture during the descent. The lake looked exactly as it had 25 years ago when she'd first seen it through Jennifer's eyes. Pristine, mysterious, alive with possibilities that seemed to multiply rather than diminish with each new discovery. But the surrounding area had evolved into something that would have amazed even Evelyn's visionary imagination. What had once been a simple platform with basic monitoring equipment was now a state-of-the-art research complex that seemed to grow organically from the cavern walls themselves. Laboratories were carved directly into the limestone, their equipment protected by the same stable temperature and humidity that had preserved the lake's ecosystem for millennia. Living quarters for visiting researchers occupied alcoves that provided privacy while maintaining visual connection to the water that was the heart of all their work. But it was the newest addition that filled Sarah with the deepest satisfaction,
a circular amphitheater carved into the cavern floor, its seats arranged in concentric rings around a central stage that faced the underground lake. This was where the Institute's education programs reached their culmination, where children and adults from around the world gathered to present their research, share their discoveries, and commit to carrying the work forward in their own communities. Today marked the 25th anniversary of Sarah's arrival at the property, and the amphitheater was filled with faces that told the story of everything that had grown from Evelyn's original vision. In the front rows sat the senior researchers who had helped build the Institute into a global force for environmental innovation. Behind them were the current graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, young scientists whose work would shape the next generation of solutions. But filling the majority of the seats were the alumni, people who had passed through the Institute's programs over the years and were now implementing its principles in communities around the world. Priya Sharma had flown in from India, where her water treatment systems now serve 23 cities. Dr. James Whitehorse, who had started as a troubled teenager in the Institute's first youth program, now directed the Indigenous Climate Solutions Network from his base in Alaska. Maria Santos, a former coal miner's daughter from Pennsylvania, led the Appalachian Renewable Energy Cooperative that was transforming her home region's economy. The diversity of faces and stories represented the Institute's fundamental commitment to inclusivity and accessibility. Environmental science had once been dominated by people from privileged backgrounds with advanced degrees and family connections to academia. The Institute had deliberately recruited from overlooked communities, urban schools with limited resources, rural areas where young people rarely saw career paths beyond traditional industries, and immigrant families where children were often the first to attend college. 25 years ago today, Sarah began, her voice carrying easily through the acoustically perfect amphitheater. I stood on the shore of the lake above us, facing the biggest decision of my life. I could sell this property and walk away with enough money to solve my immediate problems, or I could trust that a woman I barely knew had seen something in me that I couldn't yet see in myself. She paused, looking out at the faces of people whose lives had been changed by that decision. Not just her own children and their families, but hundreds of others who had found their paths through the Institute's programs. I was terrified of making the wrong choice. I was a single mother with 2 children, working multiple jobs just to survive, facing eviction from our apartment. The practical decision would have been to take the money and run. But standing here, surrounded by this incredible community, I'm reminded that the most important decisions in life aren't the practical ones. They're the ones that require us to believe in possibilities we can't yet fully see. In the audience, I could see Emma and Marcus, their own children, listening with the kind of attention that suggested they understood the weight of the moment. Alex, now preparing for his senior year of high school, had already been accepted to MIT's environmental engineering program with a full scholarship funded by the Institute. His sister Maya had just finished her first research project documenting the underground lake's seasonal variations, work that would contribute to ongoing studies of climate impacts on groundwater systems. But it wasn't just the Chen family legacy that filled Sarah with pride. Throughout the amphitheater, she could see other families whose lives had been transformed by the Institute's commitment to breaking down barriers to environmental careers. Children whose parents had arrived as refugees were now conducting research that could help their communities of origin adapt to climate change. Young people whose families had been dependent on extractive industries were developing renewable energy technologies that could provide economic alternatives for their home regions. The Institute's most important discovery, Sarah continued, wasn't biological or geological or technological. It was social. We learned that environmental solutions work best when they're developed by the communities that need them, when they address human needs alongside ecological restoration, and when they provide pathways for economic security rather than requiring economic sacrifice. She gestured toward a series of displays around the amphitheater's perimeter that showcased projects developed by Institute alumni. Solar-powered water purification systems designed specifically for refugee camps, urban agriculture techniques that turned vacant lots into community food sources, Construction materials made from agricultural waste that provided both employment and carbon sequestration. Each display represented not just a technical innovation, but a human story of transformation. Behind every patent and publication were individuals who had discovered capabilities they didn't know they possessed, communities that had gained control over their own futures, and families that had found stability through meaningful work. But perhaps our greatest achievement, Sarah said, has been demonstrating that environmental protection and economic justice aren't competing priorities. They're complementary aspects of the same goal. You can't have healthy communities without healthy ecosystems, and you can't protect ecosystems without addressing the economic needs of the people who depend on them. This principle had guided every program and policy at the Institute. The education initiatives weren't just about training environmental scientists, they were about creating career pathways that allowed people to support their families while contributing to solutions. The research projects weren't just about understanding natural systems, they were about developing technologies that communities could actually use and afford. The approach had attracted criticism from some traditional environmental organizations that preferred pure conservation approaches, and from some academic institutions that questioned the Institute's emphasis on practical applications over theoretical research. But the results spoke for themselves. Communities that had participated in Institute programs showed improvements in both environmental quality and economic indicators. Students who graduated from Institute programs had higher rates of employment in their chosen fields and lower rates of student debt than their peers from traditional programs. Dr. Chen, came a voice from the audience during the question and answer session that followed Sarah's presentation. The speaker was a young man Sarah didn't immediately recognize, though his accent suggested he was from somewhere in Africa. "I'm Dr. Kofi Asante from the University of Ghana. I've been following the Institute's work for several years, and I'm curious about your plans for expansion in sub-Saharan Africa." Sarah smiled, recognizing the hungry look of someone who saw possibilities for their own community. "We've been having conversations with partners across Africa about establishing regional institutes that would focus on challenges specific to different ecosystems and communities. What kind of work are you doing in Ghana?" "I'm working on water management systems for cocoa farming communities. Climate change is affecting rainfall patterns, and many farmers are struggling to maintain their crops while preserving forest ecosystems. I believe the biological treatment approaches developed here could be adapted for agricultural water waste, but I'd need support for community engagement and technology transfer." This was exactly the kind of opportunity that energized Sarah most, the chance to connect innovative research with urgent community needs. "Let's talk after the session," she said. "I think there might be funding available through our Global Partnerships program, and I know several of our alumni are working on similar challenges in other regions." The conversation continued for another hour, with researchers and community leaders from around the world sharing their challenges and exploring potential collaborations. Sarah listened with the satisfaction of someone who had helped create something larger than herself, something that would continue to grow and evolve long after she was no longer able to guide it. As the formal session ended and people began to disperse into smaller groups, Sarah found herself approached by a familiar face, Robert Whitfield, the lawyer who had first called her about Evelyn's inheritance 25 years earlier. Now in his 70s, but still sharp and elegant, he'd remained connected to the Institute as a member of its board of advisors. "I have to admit," he said, with a wry smile, "when I first called you about that property, I expected you to take the quick sale option. Most people in your situation would have. I thought I was doing you a favor by connecting you with the property management company." Sarah laughed, remembering her own uncertainty during that first phone conversation. "I almost took it. $15,000 seemed like a fortune to me at the time." Instead, you took a risk that has generated millions of dollars in economic activity, provided careers for thousands of people, and contributed to environmental solutions that benefit millions more. It's quite possibly the best return on investment in the history of Montana. They were joined by Jennifer Walsh, who at 63 remained the Institute's chief legal counsel and one of Sarah's closest advisors. The really remarkable thing, she said, is that none of this would have worked if Sarah had been motivated primarily by money. Evelyn chose her because she understood that the most important decisions are made for reasons that have nothing to do with financial calculations. Sarah nodded, remembering the letter Evelyn had left for her, still preserved in the Institute's archives. The old woman's words about true wealth, not money in the bank, but meaningful work, secure communities, and the knowledge that your efforts contributed to something larger than yourself, had proven prophetic in ways that none of them could have imagined. "There's something else," Robert said, lowering his voice slightly. "I've been hearing rumors that some of the major mining companies are restructuring their approaches to resource extraction. Instead of fighting environmental regulations, they're trying to partner with organizations like yours to develop more sustainable practices." This was a development Sarah had been expecting for several years. As the costs of environmental damage became harder to ignore and public pressure for corporate responsibility increased, even the most extractive industries were beginning to recognize that their long-term survival depended on changing their practices. "We've had preliminary conversations with a few companies," Sarah admitted, "but any partnerships would have to be structured very carefully to ensure that environmental protection remains the priority. We've seen too many examples of greenwashing, where companies use environmental partnerships to improve their image without actually changing their practices." "What would real partnership look like?" Jennifer asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. It would mean companies accepting that some resources need to remain in the ground permanently. It would mean investing their profits in renewable alternatives instead of just expanding extraction operations. It would mean genuine community consultation where local people have veto power over projects that affect their land and water. These weren't terms that traditional mining companies would accept easily, but Sarah had learned that change often required pushing beyond what seemed politically or economically feasible. The Institute's success had come precisely from refusing to accept limitations that others saw as permanent, from insisting that environmental protection and economic prosperity could work together even when conventional wisdom said they couldn't. As evening approached and the crowds began to thin, Sarah found herself alone in the amphitheater, looking out over the underground lake that had been the source and symbol of everything they'd accomplished. The water was as clear and still as ever, but the equipment monitoring its depths now fed data to research centers around the world. The bacterial colonies that Evelyn had first identified were now being cultivated in laboratories from Tokyo to Sao Paulo, their unique properties helping to clean up contaminated sites and develop new approaches to waste treatment. But beyond the scientific achievements, the lake remained what it had always been, a reminder that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought or sold, only protected and shared. The wealth it represented wasn't in the minerals beneath its shores, or the patents derived from its biological treasures, but in the understanding it had fostered about the interconnectedness of all life, the possibility of living in harmony with natural systems, and the power of individuals to create change that rippled outward in ways they could never fully predict. Emma found her there as the last of the day's visitors departed, settling beside her mother on the stone bench that had been carved into the amphitheater's front row. "Do you ever miss the simplicity of those early days when it was just you and Marcus and me trying to figure out how to live in Evelyn's house?" Sarah considered the question seriously. There had been a kind of magic in those first months, when every day brought new discoveries and their biggest challenge was learning to operate the wood-burning stove. Life was uncertain, but also full of wonder, each room of the house revealing new secrets, each walk around the property uncovering evidence of Evelyn's decades of careful observation. "I miss the quiet sometimes," Sarah said finally, And I miss feeling like we had all the time in the world to explore and learn. But I don't miss the fear, the constant worry about money and security and whether we'd made a terrible mistake. Emma nodded, understanding the complexity of the answer. At 34, she carried her own responsibilities now, as director of the Institute's international programs, as a mother to her own children, and as a voice for environmental justice on global stages. But she also carried the confidence that came from growing up in a place where her potential had been nurtured and her contributions had been valued from childhood. The kids who come through our programs now, they have opportunities we couldn't have imagined when we first moved here. But sometimes I wonder if they appreciate how rare it is to grow up in a place where adults believe in your capacity to change the world. This was something Sarah thought about often as she watched new generations of young people cycle through the Institute's programs. The kids who visited now took for granted access to cutting-edge research facilities, mentorship from world-renowned scientists, and educational opportunities that connected global challenges to local solutions. They'd never known a time when environmental careers were seen as impractical luxuries rather than essential professions. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the real success is when young people don't have to fight for the right to care about the environment, when they can just assume that their concerns matter and their contributions will be valued. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the play of artificial light on the underground lake's surface. Somewhere in the depths below, the unique ecosystem that had started everything continued its ancient processes of filtration and purification, unaware that its biological secrets were now helping to clean up water supplies for millions of people around the world.
As they prepared to return to the surface, Sarah took one last look around the amphitheater that had become the heart of the Institute's educational mission. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, funding proposals to review, research projects to evaluate, partnerships to negotiate. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply feel grateful for the journey that had brought them all to this point. The scared single mother who had first descended into this cavern 25 years ago could never have imagined standing here as the director of an internationally recognized research institute, surrounded by evidence of work that was helping to heal both communities and ecosystems around the world. But that woman's courage to choose the unknown over the familiar had made all of this possible. The elevator carried them smoothly to the surface, where the Montana night sky stretched overhead in a display of stars that never failed to take Sarah's breath away. City dwellers often forgot that the universe was so vast, so full of light and possibility. Living here had taught her family to think in cosmic timescales, to understand their work as part of a story much larger than any individual life. In her dreams that night, Sarah saw the underground lake as Evelyn must have seen it, not just as a treasure to be protected, but as a mirror reflecting infinite possibility, depths of potential that would continue to surprise and inspire anyone brave enough to look beneath the surface and imagine what might be possible. But more than that, she saw it as a symbol of hope that could be replicated anywhere people were willing to commit to long-term thinking, community engagement, and the patient work of building solutions that served both human needs and ecological health. The lake would continue to flow, the institute would continue to grow, and somewhere in the world, another scared parent facing impossible choices would discover that they had more power than they ever imagined. The future belonged to those brave enough to believe it could be better than the present. And thanks to one woman's vision and another woman's courage to embrace it, millions of people around the world were proving that belief right, one restored ecosystem at a time, one educated child at a time, one hope-filled decision at a time.